Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Coach's Corner. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the mind in the fight. We've got an excellent panel of coaches here for you. And as always, they definitely love questions. Make sure if you have any, you put them right in the Facebook chat and we will try to get to all of them. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Duke Brannos to get us started.
All right, awesome. So we got a great episode. We had a running line of kind of change up going on. Unfortunately, Ailgheanan wasn't feeling great, so he kind of passed it on. And this morning I was just kind of chatting and Duke Conrad from Kaid, originally down in Glen Albin, pinged me and he's like, "Hey, I'm going through the OODA loop stuff." And he hadn't actually even heard that the show was coming and that we were talking about it. So when Ailgheanan kind of dropped out, I was like, hey, this is perfect. Conrad comes with a lifetime of martial arts at a very high level. He comes also with, a police background and all of that. So there's a lot of insight there. And of course, we have Mark, our local hippie. He's like, oh, great, I'm going to be the hippie guy here. But you can't. I couldn't imagine doing this show without Mark when we get into the space of the no mind and all of those pieces because he's been practicing the whole thing and understands it probably far better than most anyone I know. So Mark, thank you for coming out. And then you have to deal with Viscountess Bess, Duke Thorfinn, and of course myself. So to start this episode, we're going to talk a little bit about the thinking process that happens inside our sport. It's really not much different than happens inside other martial arts. And there are specific things that happen that are even more, that they really even set it more. And Conrad will talk about these later when you're doing the job, when you actually are, it's life and death. Because those places there, when you hear Musashi talk, that's him after fighting all of those, matches, and because every one of them was the answer was defeat was death, right? And and when you're in that space, that the idea of mind is really set a little different or a lot different than maybe what we see it as a sport. This came about, and I told Bess I was going to throw her under the bus, so I'm going to make her explain to you how this came about and kind of where we're going. And I really hope that at the end of the show, there's going to be a lot of questions still, but I hope that gives you a little bit more insight on the idea of the mind and fight. Bess.
Thanks, Brannos. So with Coach's Corner, ever since I've been watching, Brannos has been talking about when I'm fighting, I'm really watching and I'm looking at what people are doing and I'm probing and I'm thinking the whole time. And the first few times he said this when I was watching the Zoom and chatting with a girlfriend who's a knight, and I'm like, hey, do you think when you fight? And she's like, no, I just get on the field and I fight. And I'm like, yeah, me too. Like, what the hell is this going? What's he talking about? And I'm like, I'm calling shenanigans on that. You can't think and fight, because if I'm looking at somebody and I say, oh, their sword is coming to my head, by the time I think that, it's hit me, because it takes too long to think. So I'm like, I don't understand how anybody can say that they're constantly thinking throughout the fight, and they're always watching and thinking and using Brannos' word, I'm probing, which makes me laugh like a 7-year-old boy every time. And so I was like, I don't understand this. And I have been pushing at this and questioning this. And Brannos, for easily a year now, has been trying to answer my questions on it. And I've asked the other coaches in our monthly meetings when we're setting these things up, like, what do you do? What do you think? And they're like, some of them are like, I think, and I'm like, And some of them are like, I don't think, and I'm like, haha, see, that's what I do. So I've been asking around a lot, and when I've been sitting in with some of the Ask the Dukes, I've been asking the Dukes what they do, just to get a really good feeling for what's going on, so that I can better understand what Brannos means and what other people mean when they're talking, because maybe I can steal it and use it for myself. So I think that's kind of where I was. Certainly over the past year, I've learned a lot more from Brannos, and actually Sean has helped, and Thorfinn and Duke Rongbalder, although he's not here tonight as a coach. And I've really, really pushed, and it's been an interesting year of talking about this. So I'm really hoping that you guys who were like me and didn't see yourselves when Brannos and Rongbalder and everybody said, I'm constantly thinking, that tonight that you can see a range of opinions and that you can see yourselves in one of us or in a combination of us. Because I know I didn't see myself at all, and I thought I must be doing something wrong. And I've learned that's not, we can all get to the same end by different means. And I'm hoping that tonight maybe you'll get to see some other paths.
All right, so I think we're going to start, and we got a couple of things, and we're going to go, at the end of this, we're going to give some SCA pieces on each one of these, and then we're just going to talk a little bit and ask everybody kind of how they feel, where they fit at the end. And of course, we'll be answering questions. I look forward to those. So, Mark, I'm going to talk a little bit about the void. I mean, we hear that, right? And, the void, that nothingness, that emptiness, the origin of things are Tao, right? Can you kind of help us understand that a little bit?
Well, I can talk to you about what emptiness means from the Zen and Buddhist perspective, which is probably in modern American pop culture where people are hearing about that the most, is kind of pseudo Zen stuff. And it's important to understand that emptiness is actually shorthand for empty of inherent existence, which means nothing exists independently from everything else. So there is nothing that isn't a culmination of causes and conditions coming together. So the only reason I'm here talking to you is because of all of the causes and conditions that made the laptop, that made me, that made the house, that made the electricity, that made the internet, all of those things, none of that can exist apart from everything else. So emptiness doesn't mean nihilism. It doesn't mean nothing is. It means that everything is essentially process. It's all that kind of culmination. So when we talk about fighting from that, you could say that you're fighting from this kind of constant process where you are not separate from the entire context of the fight and what's happening. So you, your opponent, the space between, the kind of terrain you're on, where the sun is, if the wind is blowing, their equipment, your equipment, how much breakfast you had that day, all of those things come together to create kind of that moment of the fight happening. And you have to be attuned and respond to that, because if you go in with some plan of I'm going to do these things and you're not in tune with all of the causes and conditions that are coming up, if you're trying to force some kind of agenda, it tends to not go so awesome.
All right.
Yep. Mushin is different. So we can hit that.
Yes, that's actually, we're going to bring that up a little bit later. So we're going to kind of hit through. I'll pop those up a little bit. So we'll cover that. But I guess we get into that void, and so Conrad, when you think of this, do you find yourself in this space, or how would you describe this? Maybe how you've seen this in martial arts or in police force work or whatever.
The harder I work, the less I think. The harder I study, the less I think. If that makes any sense. I'm not quite as advanced as Mark is. And indeed, I'm not quite as advanced as a lot of people that I've been fortunate to train with over many years in martial arts and in the SCA. But in terms of thinking, yeah, I find myself thinking in a fight an awful lot. And every time I do, it's a mistake. Every time I do, I get hit. Or I'm frankly fighting somebody who's a little bit less skilled than I am. And I'm thinking as an opportunity to develop those mental pathways while I don't have to move quickly and don't have to move smoothly. I think I'm addressing the question that you're asking, hopefully.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, but so for me, there's a quote from Michelangelo that genius, and I don't pretend to any genius, but I do pretend to having achieved some level of smoothness and skill. But in any event, genius is eternal patience. And I use a lot of principles from stage magic as well, which is if it looks effortless or or without a whole lot of cognition, it's simply because you spent an awful lot of time ahead of time smoothing out that process. And again, I'm not saying it as smoothly or as as appealingly as Mark does, but I think I'm sort of expressing the same idea, which is you work an awful lot to achieve a certain state of mindlessness.
Yeah, I would agree 100% actually. Thorfinn, how about we pop over to you and you got something on this?
Yeah, I'm starting to take notes and getting my brain wrapped around what we're talking about. So I can say that when I'm in practice, in a good headspace, I can achieve this kind of idea of being present in the moment. And what I'm talking about is maybe the concept of having, like Mark was saying, the idea that your practice that you've built for all of this time leads to the moment now, which allows you to have a free space to create in the moment. So if you go in to the concept with a structured idea of how the fight's going to happen, if it doesn't do that, you can oftentimes be kind of lost in the weeds, and you don't want to be there. You want to be able to create in the moment. Like it's jazz. Fighting is jazz, and good level, like top end fighting is jazz. It's an organic thing that is both fighters are having together, the conversation, and so I think that it's achievable, but it's not always there. And I think that it's a thing that you have to work to find, and so that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, and I think that the key here is, and I'm gonna do a couple quotes in a second, but I talk about this as we want to get into a space where we don't have to think about the step we take. We don't want to think about the angle we move. We don't want to think. We want to make these things. And remember, if I tell you to, essentially take a step right or take a step left, you have to think about that first and then do it. Later, after doing it the right way so many times, then all of a sudden those steps just happen. In a fight, it becomes organic. The less thought you have to put towards something, the easier the mind is to essentially answer questions. And those questions aren't like, oh my God, what do I do? But it's easier for your mind to essentially go, achieve flow. And that's and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's the space. And here's the key: when you're at the very beginning of your career, you're still learning how to throw a sword, you're still learning how to develop power, you're still learning how to move if you're lucky. You're still, you're doing all of these things. And for somebody that may not have had a sports or martial arts background, that's even more learning to be had, because you may not have the same natural abilities other people started with. And those people with the natural abilities can achieve these states, but the issue is sometimes their form is poor. So they roll into a poor form and then they get hit because they didn't know it was a poor form. And then that mindlessness can actually hurt you as well. So that's kind of the space that I think we're talking about here. Musashi, out of the Book of Five Rings, one of them is the Book of Void, and they say it's the shortest chapter there. With your spirit settled, accumulate practice day by day, hour by hour, polish the twofold spirit, heart, and mind, and sharpen the twofold gaze, perception, and sight. When your spirit is not in the least clouded, when the clouds of your bewilderment clear away, there is the true void. And I think he talks about it, that day by day practice, day by day, hour by hour. And all the way through this saying, he gets to the end, and at the end is that clear void. And I think that's important. And I just want to throw out there so that people see that, here's a man that, was defying death his whole career. And he wrote this late in his career. So I think it's important to see that there's a lot of knowledge out there, and that right now you may be that day by day. If you're more advanced, you may be that hour by hour, because you can change that fast and you can focus that well. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is not only physically, but mentally empty our mind and allow that to happen to us. Mark.
I just want to interject really quickly because Musashi mentioned heart and mind, something I wanted to say at some point. So this is a good opportunity. A lot of people talk about Mushin, no mind, but the Japanese character for Shin is actually heart and mind. It's a combination. And I think it's very important for Westerners to understand that it's not all intellectual logicalness. It's the Mushin is heart and mind together. And so one of the things that I say sometimes that people look at me funny or they're not sure what I mean is I talk about fighting with a soft heart, meaning being receptive to the energy that your opponent's bringing you. So I think when we start talking about Mushin, it's very important that we're actually talking about heart mind or mind heart one together and not just this thing up here, not just the computer.
No, I and that's great because the second, it's a second quote. Aggressive spirit will bring you low. In other words, being aggressive will be your end. Muscling your way is impossible over time. Give up the desire, force, direct, strangle that the world outside of me and with me in me in order to compete openly, responsibly, aware, and alive. This is all this stuff that kind of Bruce Lee talks about, which some of it's Musashi as well. To make yourself empty, which means the openness to receive, that's the idea that it's not only about an empty mind, but you have to be empty of a little bit empty of emotion as well, right? That's that heart. That's that spirit. You have to be willing to take it all in, because if I'm mad, I may not be thinking I'm mad, but my body is still creating tension because my spirit is there. So emotion can cloud that just as much. So, Bess, how'd that start?
I'm very happy with this. I know Thorfinn wants to add something. If people are in the Taoism part of this, you can look up effortless doing, and it will talk a little bit. You can learn a little bit through Taoism, through effortless doing. Something, it talks about the flow state, and you can get it through. You can just Google it, and you'll find a bunch of stuff there as well.
And we'll have a bunch of links. Now. So I'm going to ask everybody for a bunch of links at the end of this. I already have a bunch and a document, and we'll post that document up at the end as well. Thorfinn, you had something else?
Yeah, just something real quick. So there's a part in one of the books of Five Rings that I have that shows an illustration of Musashi, and he's standing with his swords down by his sides. And it says, in this position, Musashi is invulnerable, right? And you would think to yourself, he doesn't even look like he's on guard. But what he's doing is that he is free to receive whatever happens to him right now. And so he doesn't have a plan. He's going into the fight with his full skill set that he can now just extrapolate out in the moment, which is a fascinating piece of illustration, because anyone would think that person would be easy to get, right? But now he can create in the moment. And I love that particular part of that book where it shows that.
I've seen that before. I totally agree with you. So let's talk a little bit. I mean, there's probably more and more we can talk about the void, but I think a lot of these kind of feed into each other to create that whole thought, and that each kind of feed. And as we talk about it, you'd be like, well, like a lot of people, Mushin is the same thing as the void. So we'll be talking about mind, no mind, and how that philosophy fits in. And you might think, okay, that's also the void. And I think, to me, some of that is just going to be how you get there, and you may never get there. I mean, as much as we practice getting there, then we also sometimes have to come back and take a look at what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and then take those things and try to move there as well. So there's a lot of ways. This is why, like, even, people are like, I had a great day, because maybe they got into that space, knowing it or not. I mean, they're just because somebody has a great day, fights super well, doesn't mean he actually understands what he's thinking or sometimes even doing. But then when somebody has a bad day, they're like, oh, that was a bad day. But some of that might be, hey, I had a terrible ride in, I got a car accident, or somebody's not doing well, somebody didn't make it. So that impact on how you feel is affecting your fight as well. So I think you'll see this kind of as something through this whole thing. But again, for a lot of us, even the good ones, we start understanding how to get there better. I mean, I don't think there's ever perfect. I would guess that Conrad and Mark would agree that you're always working to try to find that. And even that emptiness, you're trying to find it in a lot of different ways. The more times you can find that, the easier you can get there later. It's like, hey, I'm going to throw this shot. And bang, it hit once. Okay, once out of 10 times is great. Hey, it hit twice. Two, next thing you know, you're hitting 7 times, 8 times. Maybe you're not always perfect, but it's developing. And this is the same thing that develops in heart and mind. So we have to practice those things and work. And the more we understand them, the easier it is to try to get there. So our next one is conscious versus unconscious. So again, this is one of those that could kind of go into that mind, no mind, and the unconscious could go into the thoughts of the void. But you can actually look up on Google and there's a lot of conscious versus unconscious talks and conscious. So there's actually a couple of different consciousness in it as well. But the conscious fight can be a good fight or a bad fight. So there are times when you do something to find out something else, right? The unconscious thought may become, I do that again to execute on that same thing. So, there's a lot of times, we see it, and I think this one came up in the mind, no mind, where the idea is you're fighting somebody like Mark or Conrad, and they just seem like they're kind of flowing through stuff, and you're thinking, and they don't even look like they're thinking. They're just kind of doing, and they're blocking stuff before you even set up and throw it, and but they've developed to that point where they were able to execute unconsciously that they're adding the relaxation and an empty mind and all those pieces to be in that space where they can unconsciously perform defense or unconsciously when they throw, it's perfect technique, or when they move, it's because that they have that flow inside them. And I think that's kind of what we talk about here a little bit. But I'm going to throw this at Mark again first, and then we'll come back around to Conrad next.
Yeah, there's a lot there. So I think it's important, I have to say that conscious, unconscious, that's not a phrasing that does much for me. Like, I'm not drawn to that. That doesn't do very much. But the way I experience this whole thing is that I practice all of my motions, my footwork, my sword blows, my defenses, to the point that they take processing power. I don't have to process how to step, how to throw a shot, how to do any of those things. And so that gives me freedom to just look at my opponent. I don't really have to think about any of the things that I'm doing. Now, I have no mental articulation about what's happening because that's not how I process. So for me, for example, even if I'm in that fact-finding zone, for me, it's a much more feel-based thing. I will present a little tension and feel how my opponent twitches. And that's all I need to find out where those gaps are going to flow into. And so even at the conscious level, it's not a lot of articulated thinking. There's maybe some intention to it. But for me, it's still very feel-based, very visceral. So there might be some intention and then things happen. But a lot of the things that people perceive as me being fast is because I've drilled the motion so much that I throw a shot and then I recover through defense on my way to the next thing. So a lot of that stuff is natural. A good example of how I process fights is there's a drill that I do that I teach my guys called the blind man drill. And it's helmets, it's slow work. Somebody will throw a shot and we'll block it and then we will close our eyes. And when the opponent releases tension to go to the next thing, we block where we feel is in danger. And if we get it right, they leave and we block the next thing. And so it's all about feeling where I'm in danger. It's not about looking at my opponent, seeing how they're moving, processing, making a decision. So you could say that my whole fight is based on avoiding the OODA loop for myself. Because it's all that tension and flow. That's how because I also live in the transition. So my whole fight is based on winning the transitions. I'm not a grinder. I don't get in and do a bunch of those things. So it's outside feeling tension. And so there might be some intentionality in that. And then I trust my fight to ride that flow once the tension breaks into the thing and back out. And so maybe that's the unconscious piece. But that's kind of my experience, and I don't necessarily articulate it as conscious or unconscious.
Yeah, but I think you kind of nailed it in that you have, that the idea that, there's some press and then out of that comes flow and execution.
I'm jumping in now.
Oh, there you go.
So Mark, so here's the thing about that. You said how you process is more through, for lack of a better term, through feelings rather than processing power like a computer. And then you said you'll press and you'll provide tension. And I think you said you'll see, or they will respond in a way. When they respond to you, do you think, oh, they are doing this or that? Or are you just sort of absorbing the information?
So I'm absorbing the information. So I'm much more like Duke Paul is kind of in my lineage. So when he and I fight, we talk a lot about chi and energy. So there's not really a lot of mental articulation. And even the press, it's not a physical thing. I will go out and with my posture or my energy, I will create a sense of tension or a sense of threat. And the way my opponent's body will start to tense, or the way they'll shift their weight, it's almost like I'm falling into the hole that is the opening they have created for me. So for me, it's the way I articulate is all about gut feeling and energy flow. There's not really, unless I'm in practice and I step back and go, oh, I wonder if he'll do this 5 times in a row if I do that. But in a fight, which is different than practice for me by a lot, in a fight, it's just you feel the buildup of tension and then it breaks and something happens. And if things are going very well, those are good things for me. And sometimes that's the goal.
See, so Brannos, I'm sorry, I'm taking over.
That's okay.
Okay, so Brannos, in a situation like that, you and I have talked, and you've said, for example, so Mark makes some tension, and he doesn't use his processing brain. The way we use the terms we've used, it's been the unconscious or the subconscious. Mark, you receive information and you act on the information.
But the execution of that act sometimes is still thought. The key on that is that thought is so fast because it's free that you can actually execute.
Okay, but you said to me, Bess, I see your eyes getting big. You said to me, Bess, when I'm in a fight and I'm seeing them, I see them. Aha, when I press in, they move right. So the next time when I press, I know that they're going to go right. So that's really being the computer process.
But even more than that, Bess, I'll sometimes, so that safety is first, I'll press, see what they do, and I'll press light. Then I'll press harder to see if they're actually drawing me into something. And then I will execute or leave it and see what else was open previous to it and go back to that space. So this is one of those scenarios where you can think you have that flow, but somebody can also trick you or draw you into that space if you don't read their intention correctly, or you don't feel their intention correctly. So if you got a counter shooter, that could be an issue.
Well, now I know you do it. Next time I fight you, I'm going to lie with my body. You're going to press me and I'm going to do something I totally never do. And you're going to be like, haha, Bess does this thing. I'm going to be like, haha, no, I don't.
And then I'll do it 2 or 3 more times and your body will give up.
We'll see. Okay, I can lie once with my body, but not 3 times in a row.
All right, let's go jump over to Conrad.
Like Mark, I don't necessarily find a great deal of utility in the conscious versus unconscious breakdown. There's a couple of observations that jump out at me, one of which is going to take a little while to work out. Bear with me about 2 minutes. And the other one is pretty quick. When I was young and I was wrestling a lot and doing some boxing, My dad, who'd come from a family of professional boxers and trainers, used to talk about what he called the song. And he's about as far from Zen as you can get. But he said that there's a point where there's like an internal song that's playing in the fight, and you're dancing to it. You're not really, and you're just pulled along. It almost feels like you're not doing anything consciously. It just happens. And I find that thing, if I can try to relate it to my second point, the longer one, is it's fast versus slow thinking. Slow thinking is like doctors or scientists or attorneys. Fast thinking is pattern recognition and fighting and cops. So if a cop goes out on a call, he's got about 15 seconds to make a decision quite frequently. That could be a life and death decision. An attorney is going to work out over the course of 6 months or a year whether that was the right decision or not. Because it's a very different decision-making process. That pattern recognition is the only way to fight. It's the only way if you come into an emergency room that a nurse or an emergency room doctor is going to be able to figure out what's wrong. They don't break down and do 6 months worth of tests. In 15 seconds, they start doing a triage and sending you one place or another. And when a cop walks through the door, it's the same thing. But that pattern recognition is only learned slow. It's only learned consciously. Now you can learn it in post-fight breakdown. Cops learn it. Well, a cop will walk out, do a traffic stop, and then come back and go through their head or have their buddies talk to them when they watch them and say, that was really stupid, that could have got you shot. And they get this big paranoid mindset. But the point is, what they're doing is they're breaking down failures. Like when you walked up, you had a poor angle on that car, somebody could have shot you, or you weren't able to see the hands, or this or that. And all of that post-fight debriefing or post-critical moment debriefing is slow thinking. And they talk about, they did a study with chess, and with chess they ended up wiring of sensors so they could watch people's eyes. And beginners in chess play chess the way fighters in the SCA fight. They look at their piece and they lay it out and they say, okay, now here's my bishop. My bishop can go this way. It can go that way. It can go here. You even see them hold their hand on the piece and do this, because they haven't learned pattern recognition, because they haven't played literally thousands of games or hundreds of thousands of games. A chess master, when they look at their eyes, they go boom, they break the board in 2 or 3 little sectors. They look at it and they instantly recognize the pattern. And then they can move quickly, especially when you're doing speed chess. What I find when I'm fighting is, whether I'm using slow work or film afterwards, which I'm not as good at as somebody like Sean that breaks them down to death, or even planning out ahead of time, that slow thought of this is what I'm going to do and this is how I'm going to do it. There's no time to do that in the fight. But if I don't take the time to develop that, I guess I'd say consciously, but I prefer to think of the slow thinking. If I don't slowly think it through when I have the time to think it through, then when I don't have the time, when I don't have the time to think at all, because there's thought going on, it's just not conscious. It doesn't work. So I break it down to slow and fast thinking and pattern recognition versus what's called, a more deeper breakdown of everything. That's it. I have no.
I think that was great, actually. I really like that you kind of threw the pattern and the song piece in, because I do know people that they tend not to be able to get to that with really like, I'm going to clear my mind. They get there through, some people even will hum or sing a song through their head to clear. So it helps them clear their mind so that they can go into the next piece. And, and I've heard of more than one person that does it, which is very interesting. Thorfinn.
This just now, what you just said reminded me of a couple of the best tournaments I've ever had. I had an earworm of a song that was stuck in my head that was just going back and forth, and it allowed me to be separate from that, because all I was thinking about was that damn song. It was the Hong Kong Phooey song from a cartoon. I don't know if you remember that cartoon from the 70s, but it was like, I was just sitting there rocking out the whole time, and it allowed me then to be just there and not have to be thinking about that, because that's what was predominantly in my thought process. And so I didn't have time to think about the fights. One of the things about we were talking about earlier is how do you get here? And sometimes you lose this place, right? You don't have it every time, and part of that is learning to find your focus. I find whatever that is that you can then kind of shed all the things around you and become part of that moment. And every fighter has a different kind of way of doing this. And some people it's a salute, some people it's part of the way that they stand at the last second or whatever. But having this thing that can kind of anchor you, bam, to right now, to the present, is a really important step in finding your way back to this kind of clear mind situation, I find. For me, it can oftentimes be, like I said, I do a salute, right? And I could be having all kinds of stuff going on in my day. But as soon as I do this one particular salute, now I'm here. I'm in this fight right now. And it allows me to almost instantly shed the majority of the problems of the day, right? And so having this ability it's like a shortcut to that, and I think that that's helpful. And it's not the same for everyone. And I find that people will, throughout their career, will come in and out of this process, right? And sometimes you'll find that you're achieving it very easily, and then sometimes it's a struggle, and maybe you won't be able to get to that exact spot, that clear mind spot, or whatever you want to call it, the zone, right? You want how to get to the zone, and so I think there's ways to, like I said, there's ways to do shortcuts, but you have to kind of work on those things to allow yourself to find that path for you. So that's kind of where I'm at. Where I'm kind of bouncing off the conversation that everyone's having, and I'm really having a great time. So
I'm with you, brother. I get it, and I think this kind of goes into that space where, early off in the episode, I mentioned that both me and Thorfinn and Bess is kind of falling into the same route, is that we kind of grew organically into it via the SCA, where both Mark and Conrad, have some deeper experience, both inside and outside the SCA. With many of these ideas. So it's been kind of fun. I'm hoping that you can kind of relate some of this, because I'm a real big believer in the more you understand, the easier it is to get to your goal. And that's what we're trying to do in tonight's episode. So Conrad, you have something?
Yeah, I mean, I feel real privileged to be here. I think I'm like halfway, maybe some days good enough that I get to have these privileged conversations with folks like you. And one of the conversations I had was, I've got an injury in my shoulder, and it's just getting worse and worse, though. As an aside, that doesn't matter to anything. Like fate had a friend of mine that's a doctor, an osteopathic surgeon that I haven't talked to in a very long time, called me like a week ago out of the blue. And when I told them about my shoulder, they said, you should fly to Vegas and we'll fix it. So maybe my right shoulder will someday be okay. But at this point, training has been no fun, so I switched to left. And because I feel very fortunate that I was able to have conversations with Mark, with you, and with Sean as 3 examples of people that immediately I said, okay, I'm completely switching, different pattern, different everything, and be fighting left-handed. Can you help me out? That was maybe 3 months ago that I started that path. And one of the things that Sean said clicks right in here. And of course, it wasn't something that surprised me, but he boiled it down. He said, okay, so there's different blows you're going to throw left-handed than right-handed. You know how to throw them, but they're not pre-patterned, or they're not programmed at this point. Throw them until you don't have to think about them, and then everything else will just start clicking. And that really had something. And if I can be a little bit greedy and take another moment of time, Thorfinn said something a second ago that clicked with me as well, because that's what you guys are doing. You keep talking, and I say, oh, when I say this, and then somebody, but the last crown that I fought, I fought it about 6 weeks out of gallbladder surgery, and I was really mad at myself because my body was falling apart. And it didn't help that Duke Sean tooled me up, and not only tooled me up at Sport of Kings about 2 weeks before that crown, but he jumped on top of me, and I'm kind of arrogant enough to think that if I'm chest to chest, I don't typically lose, and he jumped right chest to chest with me, beat me up there, and did so telling me that it was because I was fighting weak. So I walked into that crown a few weeks later, a little bit annoyed, kind of really pissed off, and I was angry all the way up to that crown at a level I think would probably disturb somebody like Mark, who seems to be much better grounded than I am. And I fought the crown, and I have my persona that I'm fighting with. I was joking, laughing, talking to everybody, and I was being my typical smart-ass self. And then I went to dinner after the crown, and suddenly I couldn't sit at dinner with anybody. I had to walk away and walk the parking lot for about 2.5 hours, because I realized that I was really still angry, and there are people that I wanted to hit, which is not something I do in fighting generally. I try not to take that out there. But I found it was really interesting that I didn't have a moment of that, or a shred of that. I make no pretense of being, a great SCA fighter, or a great, or having that great mindset. But until that point, I hadn't realized just how much there's a fighting in a tournament that I care about mindset, and versus my everyday walking around in the emotions and everything that I carry on an everyday basis. It genuinely surprised me afterward. Anyways, I don't know if that aside has any value, but it occurred to me with both things talking.
Yeah, I think that kind of falls into that spirit piece. I'm going to go ahead, Bess, and then Mark after Bess.
Okay, I just want to echo something that Thorfinn had said, and something that we here at Coach's Corner, we've had an episode on. Thorfinn, you were talking about centering yourself before a fight. Some people it's a bow, some people it's an earworm or something. One of the things that we've talked about is rituals to help you sort of center you. And Mark, I don't know, maybe that ties into something like a walking meditation. I know Duke Eliyahu talks that he does several things sort of in a row, and he discussed that. And I'm wondering if perhaps, I've never thought about it until just Mark, what you had said, and then listening to Thorfinn. Do you think that would be a sort of a bringing a meditation technique or thing?
Yeah, a trigger. A trigger.
Thank you. Into your pre-fight.
Mark, go ahead.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'm a big believer in triggers. A lot of the ceremonial stuff that surrounds any religious practice is really about cultivating a certain mindset. We get used to the smells and the bells and the chants, or like Conrad would know, as soon as I put my gi on, I start sweating, because after all these years, right? After all these years, my body knows certain things. And so if you can very intentionally cultivate a mindset when you're home and comfortable and practice, when you go and do it on the tournament field, your body's going to go, this is the thing we do now. And so absolutely intentionally creating those triggers is super effective. And much like Thorfinn, mine is also a salute. Yeah.
So on that point, and just, for me, it used to be a salute, and I still think it's the same way, but I think my trigger is much shorter now. For a long time, it was like the one thing out of everything that's happening on the field was saluting the one who you fight for. And that was just zoned me. And, it was just like, I'm here to do a job. And it just set me in that place. Now, if it happens, no matter what, I think, hey, I still kind of peek back into that space. But, it's like you step your foot on that field and I can kind of snap in. But again, I think that's a practice. And I think we lay down, like religious arts and things like that. We lay down a really big structure. People can kind of help guide them to the end where they can find that. And as you practice more and more, it becomes easier and easier. This is very much like I was talking about earlier about learning how to use your mind and relaxing your mind. These are all tools we talk about. And those, that idea of setting those triggers or setting the ceremony around it helps people get to that place. So however it does, and that place at first might take a long time. It might be, hey, I need like a minute in a salute to get through this. And then the next thing you know, it's like, no big deal. It's like, bang, I'm ready. I'm ready to go, because they practiced it so many times, it becomes easier and easier. So, all right, I think we beat that one up. And I actually, the one thing I want to say is I agree with you guys 100%. I'm not a big conscious, unconscious guy. I think that actually fills, I think the other things that are a little bit more historical fill that conscious and unconscious piece fill into those places. But it's kind of I think, an American culture to think conscious, unconscious type of deal. So we didn't grow up with those other things, and most of us is like either you're conscious or unconscious about how you do things, and I just wanted to make sure that was part of the conversation, because I think some people are going to look at fighting in the mind in that way, that simple. So our next one is, and this one should be fun, mind versus no mind, or as Mark says, Mushin. And you had a better pronunciation, no mind. How was that said?
Yeah. Oh, no mind is fine. I think.
Okay. And it's interesting because I actually found a site that also talks about kind of there's a couple of different ideas about mind, no mind, and the immovable mind even. I documented a link to that. He talks about it quite a bit. And it was a nice YouTube or audio. So I'll post that up later, but let's jump into the mind, no mind, Mushin, flow state, those pieces, maybe a little deeper. And kind of the fighting, let's start with the fighting mind, Zanshin, kind of a total awareness, alertness, being aware of your surroundings and enemies, while being prepared to react. So there's a little bit more mind involved in that layer. It doesn't mean that you're constantly still thinking there. I think it means, and again, and this is what everybody will say, I think it means that you're prepared. You're also not in this space where you're not aware of what your surroundings are, and you can still be comfortable in that space, not grueling thinking about it, but you're also walking through a space and you're in that position to be able to go into flow and react. Mark?
So Zanshin is something you hear about a lot in Japanese martial arts, particularly sword arts.
Yep.
So if you go through one of their katas in Aido or Kenjutsu, at the end, they'll talk about Zanshin. And so if you see people pose, sometimes you'll hear the instructors calling that out. I would say that's more probably something you would experience on the war field, because I relate Zanshin a little bit more to in the modern world, like, and Conrad, I'm sure, knows these better than me, the codes of color, like red state, yellow state, green state kind of thing. And Zanshin might be like yellow state, that kind of like awareness and readiness. So that I find that happens for me more on the war field, because in a tournament setting, you know exactly what's happening. You're going to go out and fight that one guy. And so I find a slightly different experience of that kind of awareness. So I think I'll defer to people who do that a little bit more often.
Okay, Conrad.
Because I think probably an interesting point with Zanshin, and that will lead into what I'm talking about, is that in some martial arts, and one that I studied, because I did some Kenjutsu many, many years ago, and it is used to describe your ending posture when the technique is done. Now, that seems kind of weird, and it almost seems like the exact opposite of what Mark is talking about right now. But the point is that if you take somebody to the ground, for example, and you're not paying attention to what's around you, your awareness and posture becomes really important, because there might be a second attacker, there might be a weapon nearby, and so when you're talking about a samurai that's fighting, usually wearing a silk kimono with some very sharp and very overpowered weapons, being in the right defensive and posture and being aware of what's going on is important. I can't talk about it in a spiritual sense, because I don't grok with it that way as much. If I walk through, there's that scene in the Seven Samurai where the various samurais walk through the door, and the various ways they deal with somebody on the other side of the door ready to whack them on the head with a stick. There's a peasant that's going to whack the different samurai on the head, and they interact with it a little bit differently one way or the other. When I walk through a door, and this is a new thing, it was a thing that came to me after police work, not before. If I'm going to turn to the left, I always glance to my right. Now, that's because I want to know if there's going to be a problem with somebody behind the door, or somebody, around somebody who has an angle of attack on me, which was very important with firearms. And if I don't look, if there's an angle that I don't look into, I don't scope that out, it'll make me feel really bad, and it'll give me that tingling feeling, which is probably some of that psychic that people are talking about, where you're saying, I just felt like there was somebody looking at me. Well, if you get used to the point of scoping out those dark corners, scoping out those bad angles, and then you realize as you're standing in a room that there's an angle you're not aware of, that may be part of the process. But I'm not. For me, Zanshin is, and it goes back to ending posture. It's habit as much as anything else. Like I said, I walk through a door by habit. I want to walk through a door in my house with my children running around. I look behind me, and other than looking for Legos to step on, there's not really a reason in the house. But it becomes a habit, and that habit, that habit becomes once it becomes habituated, it's almost like it's not happening. You don't have to put a lot of energy in it. I hopefully that's all.
No, I think that was I think you did a great job there. And I think the energy, the idea of understanding, this falls into that, being aware of your surroundings and what's there. And I think, I think in a lot of ways, even when we enter into a fight, we enter into that position where it's like, what can he do with what he has and the way he stands, right? And so we're already into that space where we're making a little bit of mental analysis of our surroundings, and those surroundings may be that person, and the list field and the size can, and all of those pieces are coming in to allow you to analyze that space that you get to work inside of. There's a great question that came in is how can you recommend somebody go about learning or developing these no mind skills along their path? Are there some drills or incremental progression that we can talk about? And I definitely want to talk about this, but first I'm going to throw it over to Thorfinn to see if he has anything on kind of the mind piece of this that we were just talking about.
I immediately felt like Mark, that this was more of a war type of experience, and the way I kind of perceive it is it's the ability or the stance that you're observing your opponent's line and be able to read that, to be able to react to the moment and be able to do what you need to do in that situation, and that's taking assessment of things like what weapon form they have over there. Are there spearmen? Are any of these spearmen hot right now? What I mean by hot, are they actually active combatants? So there's a lot of times you see people on the battlefield, they're more of a space filler right now than even a fighter. And so you have to be able to rapidly assess those things. And that's what I felt about that particular type of mindset, that's how I perceived it. More of that, less than how I would do a single combat.
Bess, you do a lot of melee. I'm sure you're sitting there nodding away.
Yeah, I live for melees in war. And with the group that I fight with, I am primarily a shield, and I fight next to a spear fighter. Hey, Mikey, I saw you online. And for me, it's being aware of everything that's going on all the time, but it's like a movie. It has to fall out of your brain. If I'm remembering something from 30 seconds ago, then it's not current, and I will get the spear guy, because we're working as a team. I keep him alive and he gets the kills. If I'm remembering something from 30 seconds ago, then he's going to get killed because that's not the current situation. So while I might be tracking, and my guys will tell you, I'm like, okay, watch the spear to the left. There's a combat archer 2 o'clock. Watch this. I'm going to move over. I'm taking a half step forward. And it's a running dialogue, which helps me, because that was one of the questions. It helps me sort of be in that state. And I say it, my guy knows, and then it's out of my head. And I agree with Mark. It's a multi-person, a melee or a war thing. And man, do I love that. Best thing ever.
All right, let's jump back to that question. Is there, and we haven't really talked about no mind yet. So I'm sure there's going to be more. We can go ahead and fall into the no mind piece, or what and Mark, you can probably that was let's see here, or Mushin, right? So we'll get a lot more talk on that one. But is there specific ways that you practice these kinds of things that develop into the understanding?
Well,
I mean,
so no mind sounds all mystical and woo-woo, but really all it is mindfulness without getting stuck on anything. So you're present without latching onto things. And so anything that's going to let you do that. So in a non-combat sense, there are types of meditation that are really good for that. There are certain kinds of meditation which like focus on this image or this mantra, and that's not really what I'm talking about. More like breath following, there's breath counting, or there's what we call awareness practice. Some of my students who don't like breath counting will say, okay, you sit, can you hear the sounds around you? Okay, are you aware of the feel of your palms on your thighs? Can you hold both of those at the same time? Can you feel the air currents flowing around you? Can you hold all three of those at the same time? And usually people, they kind of fall apart pretty quickly, but you just keep coming back. And if that is even too woo-woo for you, go wash the dishes and be aware of what the plate feels like under your hand. Be aware of what the water feels like running over your fingers, how the soap feels, without commenting on it. Don't have a running commentary, because that's not mindfulness. Just feel the plate, feel the water, feel the slipperiness of the soap. And what you're going to find is every 5 seconds, your brain's going to woof off onto a thought and just come back. A lot of meditative practices, whether it's an active thing like washing dishes or sitting on your butt on a cushion, is the practice of coming back. But what you'll find is that those muscles, just like anything else, it'll be a little bit easier to fall into mindfulness and a little bit easier to catch yourself and come back. It'll get faster. In a combat, I'll stop for a second.
Oh, no, I was telling Brannos to come to me next. You go.
okay.
In a combat sense, there are some drills that we really like that are really focused on that intuitive feeling sense. So I described one already, the blind man drill, where we put on the helmets, the opponent throws a shot, you watch it come in, you block or whatever your tools are, and then you close your eyes and they have a little pressure. And when that pressure leaves, if you're thinking, you're just going to get smacked. So feel where you get that sense of danger and go to the next one, and then feel, and do this to like 3 touches and then switch roles, because it's very taxing. Like you'll find that your mind fatigues. Another one that's good is, we call it the threat drill. I'll line up with my students and we think about the student in 4 quadrants, right? Very German longsword, everybody's 4 quadrants. And no contact, not even necessarily weapons, but I will go out and I will put pressure on one of the quadrants on my student. And they're trying to, I feel that pressure. And then we reset, and I'll put pressure. And so it forces you to be mindful of what you're feeling in the fight, rather than thinking about it or doing that kind of stuff. And again, that gets mentally tiring pretty fast, but it's all about developing that mindfulness muscle, because you don't actually make Mushin happen. In my experience, you make yourself more and more receptive to Mushin occurring, if that makes any sense. So
It totally does.
yeah. So the more you can be receptive to it, it's actually a thing that arises rather than a thing you force to happen. Hopefully that's helpful for people.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. You talk about, putting pressure into zones and them calling it. I've been doing that for probably 25 years while traveling, because what I do is I stand 2 people across from each other and I say, okay, I want you to start and make big movements and big pressure. And then I want the other person to call out where: head, back of the head, center line, leg. And then I'm asked them to make smaller and smaller pressures until you're almost literally like, and what I find is that, and I bring this up all the time, is people are like, they can actually feel it much faster than communicate it. And in fact, sometimes their communication is totally wrong, even though they're pointing to the spot that actually the pressure went to. So it's to give you a feel of that mind piece fitting in there. I see this all the time. I'm like, after a while, I was like, don't bother calling it, because you're having a hard time putting words to it. You're feeling it the right way, but now you have to think about how to put words to it. So now just point, and So it's kind of a method, and that what I'm in that way, what I try to use it as is a tool to help people understand that they do feel these things, and that they can that's a skill they have, because the more we help people understand that they are feeling those things, the more they're able to realize they can use that for themselves, and the easier that becomes. So, I like your blind drill. I think there's probably a ton of drills out there. I think a hard part for people is they tend to go through drills thinking about each piece of the drill. And that's what breaks down that no mind quite a bit, because you're constantly thinking, okay, what do I got to do next? And in the end, we have to get rid of that. Now, you may have to start there to get that pattern, but in the end, the goal is to free yourself of that. Conrad.
And I mean, the first reaction I had was when you were talking about reacting to movements, and I don't know why, it's kind of a random reaction to a little observation that Gavin DeBecker has in a book called The Gift of Fear. And what he talks about is, he said that we all have this big feeling that our dogs have this great sense of other people. Well, I should have known that guy was a bad guy because the dog didn't like him from the start. And what he said is that the dogs are actually they have non-existent people sensing skills. What they're good at is sensing their owners. And if you're listening, you indeed do have these reactions when you meet a bad person. You're stifling them, you're not paying attention to them, you're second guessing them, and they're so small that maybe you can't hear them. And I think that's a pretty good analogy to what Mark and you were talking about with regard to pressure and fighting. Mushin in general, that's what we're talking about right now, right? I've been listening. Okay. Well, I've always found Mushin, I mean, it's an interesting concept, and I make no great claim that I exercise it, but it's usually described as some kind of freedom from thoughts, or freedom from ego, or freedom, almost like Mark had described meditation earlier, which is not entirely inapplicable. I mean, there's a reason why it's describing meditation, and it sounds an awful lot like these passing thoughts that go through your head when you're fighting, but they just go away, and those random thoughts, the ego, the sense of self disappear. But I've also heard it, so I agree with that, but I've also heard it described as a freedom or an unfettering from techniques. And in the SCA, I find that to be a really nice focus on the whole idea, because usually when you have a fighter that's a little bit newer out there, they're thinking about this flat snap or that or whatever, and that becomes their entire mental process when they're going out there. Indeed, for a beginning fighter, I have a cheat, and this does not work for a good fighter. This does not work for a more experienced fighter, but for a less experienced fighter, I tell them what you need to do is find those spots on the ground where you're practicing in front of your pal, and try to maneuver yourself so that you can get to those spots when you're fighting somebody, which to some degree lets them get to a spot where their mind is a little bit unfettered, and also allows them to achieve positional advantage. But I don't have a lot more with regard to Mushin that. It would be really interesting to hear what Thorfinn has to say about it.
So Thorfinn, go ahead.
So one of the things we're talking about is like what types of drills or ways that you can try and get to learn this path, right? And one of the things that everyone here has said is basically you have to trust yourself. You have to be, allow yourself to be in that moment. And the way you do that is you have to take time at practice to stop planning what the other person's going to do. And so when you go up to take, when you're working on a technique, work on that technique, right? Until it becomes part of your fighting style. But take a few minutes of each fight that you do with someone, or set of fights, excuse me, and use that as a time to say, I'm going to not expect anything from them and just fight what happens. So get into your defensive stance, present your offense, right? And then let it happen. If you go into it, like I was saying earlier, and every single one of us has said this, with formulated plans, you're going to find that you're not achieving this kind of open space in your head. You are following a path instead of just being there. And so I think that as a drill you can do is you can try and take a little bit of time to work on that and take that time to focus on that part of your fight. And this also helps in tournaments too. Try and go to smaller tournaments and get the experience that allows you then to be safe, to not have all of the side things that you have, like all the salutes and all of those things continuously detracting or distracting you from being aware of what's going on. And so I think that those are the type of things you can work on and ways to try and get there.
So it's interesting. I asked Bess because Bess talks to Rongalder all the time, and Rongalder has a really good saying here. Louis actually in the comments on the video brought it up, and so I asked Bess, and she gave me a face like Rongalder never said that. So he's holding out on you, Bess. I would call him out on it. So Rongalder, I heard this out of him multiple times, and I think this flows right into what Conrad was saying, and that is, when you first drive a car, you're like, here I am. I got two hands on the wheel. I make sure they're, 10 and 2 or whatever, and I'm gonna turn left. So first thing I do is I turn my blinker on, get my hand back on the wheel, and I'm thinking about all of this. Get both hands on the wheel, and then I look right, and then I look left, and then I look right, and then I got to turn the wheel, and then I got to turn the blinker off, and then I got to turn the wheel back, and I'm thinking through all of this stuff, and you're going about 5 miles per hour, and everybody hates you, and you have student driver in the back of your car, right? and then the next thing you know, you're out there pretty much turning the corner with your knees when you're drinking a Coke and putting eyeshadow on or something. It's things. What happens is we get into that space where you're actually looking left and right, and you could make a mistake. You could not actually be totally clear. So you always have to kind of go back. You could fail at that. In other words, I'm going to turn. I turn my blinker on. No big deal. That's just part of turning. So I hit the blinker. I look, and then I turn, and then I go back, and I just go on. I'm not thinking about it. I just turn left. I didn't have to. All of those other steps are gone, right, for me, because I don't have to think about them. Now, I think the key here is, and this is something I keep coming back, and the reason why we are trying to educate people is that if you don't know all those steps, then when you fail, it is next to impossible to fix it. If something happens and you're against an opponent and you fail, you lose because it was something unexpected. You may not know how to fix the things you're doing that allowed them to get there. And so if you're instinctual, it can come at a price. If you really don't know, what you're actually doing to be instinctual, because I see this happen all the time. Someone's very instinctual, and then slowly their shield drops a little bit. Slowly their front foot starts turning a little bit, and their fights start failing. And they can't figure out why. And this is where the idea of a coach comes into. They're like, hey, turn your foot back out and put your shield back up. And then they're like, oh, that's right. And then they fix it, and then they get back into the flow of it. So, I think this is the point I really want to try to get out to everybody is we are trying to communicate. I'm really huge, especially when I teach, explaining everything to you so that you know where the failure was. Conrad, you got the question. You use that new technology for us with the waving hand on the screen.
I just, by way of disclosure, my lady Raina is one that actually got me into this Zoom meeting. So that was discovery in real time. So look, you said something about that, and I think that it's interesting, and there's an analogy from stage magic that applies. You get a magician that does a trick. They're up on stage and they do something. You go, wow, they made an elephant disappear. If you want to talk about the great trick of mescaline, where he made an elephant disappear on stage, and then and then part of the magic is people afterwards trying to break it down and say, how did he do that? And the mistake that most people make that allows that magic trick to remain unsolved is usually they pick a wrong time for the time that the magic happened. They don't. I'm always happy to amuse you, Grace. They pick a wrong time for the when they want to break it down. So when you're talking about a fight, I find that usually the failure, when you get especially a beginning fighter, they're usually looking at the wrong place and time for why they got killed. They say, well, if I that this or that, and usually it's several steps back, in the process where there's probably a failure of concept or doctrine that causes that whole thing to happen. The elephant was not there on stage. By the time it disappeared, you're already looking at a reflection of the elephant, not the actual elephant, for example.
Awesome. Bess, sorry, I missed your hand. That Conrad's raised hand threw me totally off. So I was like, oh, look at that hand. That's an awesome idea.
Do that. That's what I was just like, I got to figure out how to do that.
Now Conrad has to figure out how to turn it off.
I just want to go back to a question we were asked, because for me personally, it's super relevant. And it was, so how do you recommend someone go about learning or developing these no mind skills along their martial path? Are there some drills or incremental progressions we can talk about? So before I answer this, I want to say thank you, Mark, because you've given me the answer to this question, which I had for myself this evening. At 7 o'clock, I didn't have the answer, but now I do, because I will be in that position. I have been, and always will be primarily a melee and a war fighter. I love them. And Mark, you were talking about ritual, how certain things have bells, literally bells and whistles and whatnot. And I thought to myself, when I'm fighting with my household, say, I don't think we do any ritually stuff, but in point of fact, we do. I started thinking about it, and I found that it was, I fight with one of several people, 3 people, and I'm always in the same place, and we're in the same place in the line, and the group gets together ahead of time, and we talk, and we walk out to the field together, and I do my own little personal goofy thing, which I'm not going to tell everybody about because it's embarrassing. And at practice, for example, my spot is at the end of the bench under the clock. And a couple of times we've had new people come to practice and they sat there and I'm like, no, that's my place. And they're new kids, right? So I'm not going to make them move their armor bags. I'm just like, fine, I'll sit in the middle of the bench. But I realize that when it comes to tourneys, and this is the answer to the question, and I'm sorry this taken me a long time to get there. Mostly I had to figure this out as we were talking. I will, when it comes to tourney, deliberately try to invent something. And at first I know it will feel fake. Oh, look at me. I'm going to do this thing. And it's stupid. And I'm going to go, this is not going to work. And it won't. The first few times I do the thing, maybe a half dozen times, it's not going to work. And I'm going to go, this is dumb. It's not working. But I do know that with repetition, it will become a ritual or a tradition. And I'm not sure how I'm going to figure that out, because you never know where the sites are and you never know where you're going to put your bags and you never know what your friends are. So I'm going to have to find something inside me. And to answer the question, I think that we'll all have to do that. Find something that you can do for yourself. Maybe it's laying your armor out in a certain way. Maybe it's putting your armor on and then going to see your friends. Maybe it's doing something in a certain way. This is my helm is here, my shield is here, and my sword, the other thing I use, is here, and it'll be left, right, and I'll find something for me. Or maybe it'll be, I will always pack before tournaments M&Ms, M&Ms and some apple juice or something like that, so that I can eat them or drink them before the tournament. So I will invent them. So while I don't actually have a good recommendation on what to do, I would say to the person who asked the question, you're going to have to find something that works for you that you can do every time. And I think that will be the consistency thing that I will have to do. And it will probably be something, I always have to worry about my blood sugar. So it'll probably be, make sure I put my box of apple juices over here, make sure I do X or Y. And Mark, thank you, because I realize that one of the things that I get antsy-pantsy about tourneys, I don't have any rituals for tourney. I have them for practice, I have them for melees, I have them for war, but not tourney. So thanks, man. I really appreciate you saying that. I like a lot.
So I think the key on that is the downside. Remember, that ritual is all thought.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
so just covering something here for you, Bess.
I know.
And it's no different than what a chess match is. I'm going to lay out all my pieces this way, so that now I know where I'm starting from. Be careful that you don't set those up so much. Mark, I got you next. Be careful you don't set them up so much that if one falls over, everything fails.
Certainly.
So it's the practice of getting there that's the most important piece.
Yeah, so certainly when we had the conversation with, particularly I remember Tristan and Dubiliahu talking about it, saying that if it does come to pass that you can't do your ritual, well, then you're blown all to hell, and that's not good. So rituals, I do understand they have to be fluid, and certainly like when I'm fighting in melees, I don't always fight next to the same person, but I'm always with this group or I'm always with that group. So I will find something I can be both consistent and fluid with. Oh, I'll get right on that. But something that I can feel comfortable with, so that every tournament isn't a shock. Like, oh, now I'm over here. Now I'm over there. Now I don't know where my friends are. And I think for myself, that will be very helpful.
Yeah, well, it's a tool. So, Mark, go ahead.
Thank you. So I was actually going to say, I think you're actually talking about a couple different things. So when I think about kind of managing my mind for tournaments, there's the way, so I tend to be an anxious tournament fighter. I don't get angry or that kind of stuff, but I have that. So I know there are things that help that on the way. So for example, I train as much as I can, because I know for me that when I get to the tournament, if I have done everything I could have done, it's much easier to let go, because what else could I have done? As opposed to, I skipped this practice, I didn't do my Pell work, I skipped a gym set. And then if I fail, well, I could have done more and I can beat myself up. So there's a lot of that kind of like managing of yourself. And that's different than ritual. That's knowing how you function as a person. And for also, for example, the week before a tournament, I don't lift weights and I don't do a full contact practice because I don't want to be banged up right before a tournament. So I've kind of learned how my mind and body functions best going into a tournament. And I do check on my gear beforehand, that kind of stuff. That I think is different. The ritual piece, I would say, can be and should be very, very short, because you don't want to be tied to this big elaborate thing. So for me, my ritual is that I find my wife on the field, I point my sword to her, I salute, I exhale and let the excess energy go down at my feet. That's all it takes. And even in describing it, I'm getting the chills right now, because my body has gotten so keyed into that motion with that intention that that's all it takes to switch me into the mindset. So I think there's the prep to manage all the distractions and anxiety to become more receptive to the no mind arising. And then there's the trigger, which can be super, super short, and should be, because you won't always have time to do all that stuff. And so I would say for people at home, there's the building the mindfulness skill, which is one thing, and that's the meditation or the washing dishes or the feeling drills that we've been talking about. Then there's the managing your mind and body on the way, so that you are as grounded as possible to be more receptive to that good day happening. And then there's the trigger that might flip you into that state. And all of those things are necessary, but I would say maybe a little different. And I hope that makes sense to everybody.
No, I love it, man. I think you kind of nailed some of that. Thorfinn, were you going to say something? Oh, okay. I think you kind of nailed it. And I like that you broke that out so that people understood better. And I hope, Bess, that helps you as well. I kind of understand all three pieces that are going on there.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. By elaborating on that, it lets me think of things more clearly and in a there's this and that, various sections. And although I'm going to say, I never feel like I do enough, I can always beat myself up.
All right. So Conrad, you had something to say here.
Yeah, I did. And I think Mark hit something on the head when Bess was talking. I think there were two things that are being conflated. And one is what your optimal state is. When you're fighting an attorney, that state of no mind, that optimal state, and then how to get there, what triggers there are to get there. So there's two separate things you're talking about. You talk about ritual and this and that, but we've probably talked an awful lot about how to achieve whatever optimal state. You've used the term flow state, and I wouldn't use that. I'd use it for something a little bit different. But that state of no mind that you achieve when you're fighting, but then how to get there, and it's a little bit different. I mean, you could talk about NLP, where you're linking physical triggers or actions to a different mental state or a switch in mental state. And your mileage is going to vary depending on whether you think that NLP is crap or not. The same thing, with all due respect, when you're talking about Zen or Eastern meditation, you can think that's crap, or you can think there's a lot to that, and that's going to. But in the end, there's some of us have triggers. I never really thought I tried very hard to set up triggers to achieve an optimal state, and it just didn't work for me. And I mean, part of it is a brief insight in me. Everybody that talks to me, because I argue a lot, I tend to do a lot of fighting in a lot of ways, including conversationally. So people think I'm kind of an argumentative and angry person. Actually, I really like to be liked, and I really like to be agreeable. I've got a very high agreeable quotient if you test me. I just really enjoy fighting at any level, including, I've discovered, up to some very serious stuff. I enjoy it. I don't take it personal, and it's fun for me. So I didn't, so leaping into a tournament never seemed like a difficult thing for me. It was this last crown that I fought in 5 years ago or whatever, where I actually learned that there is a different state for me when I'm in a tournament that is dramatic. And how you achieve that state, God, I still haven't figured that out. Mark obviously has something with the salute and letting the breath out, and I think Duke Miles explains it almost exactly the same way. But I think your mileage, I think what your particular trigger is going to be is kind of self-selected. Anyways.
So, we got really into the organic conversation here, so I'm going to go ahead and move it on. We're going to cover the OODA loop a bit. And, I think this is a really interesting concept. Mark talks about constantly kind of being outside that OODA loop. And I think after Conrad's done talking about this a little bit, you'll kind of see where Mark's piece comes from that. But a lot of times, even inside the OODA loop, there's parts of that are there to break other people's OODA loop and get you doing it faster than they are, and making those decisions, setting those things up. And that is actually part of that process as well. And I tend to do the same thing, Mark. I constantly break it. I've been telling people for a long time, if I shift the line and can set up and throw faster than somebody else, because that's what I practice, then it's easier to execute. So if I'm always shifting, when I fall into something and shoot because I can see it immediately, I'm practicing that quick execution, where other people grind their feet into the ground, set up, and then you slide to the left. They're like, okay, I got to turn, grind my feet into the ground and set up. And that takes longer for them. And so it's something I practice. That's how I do it. But Conrad, can you explain this to us? The OODA loop?
You mean Boyd's OODA loop itself?
Yep.
Sure. There was a guy named John Boyd who taught at the Combat Air School for the Air Force. He never actually wrote any books about. They called him 40-second Boyd because he was supposed to be able to win a dogfight in roughly 40 seconds against anybody, which a lot of people have disputed. But he was very good. And if you've read any of his stuff, and I've read all of it, he was a technical thinker. I mean, I really can't get through most of the stuff we specifically talking about airplanes, because he's got a lot of math and a lot of stuff that's beyond my limited brain. But what he came up with was that in any conflict situation, there's a cycle people go through. And I'll talk about that real briefly in just a minute. I'm sorry I wasn't actually prepared to talk about this, but I can at any point. But that cycle you go through is a cycle that begins with your observational abilities and ends with you launching a technique or whether it be a defense or an attack or what have you, or a repositioning or some action. And Boyd broke it down. Boyd broke it down into 4 discrete steps. And what's happened since then is a lot of people have picked up on it. While I said Boyd never wrote a book, he had a couple papers, one really short one and a longer one, and he had a slide presentation. There's probably 30 books out there right now about John Boyd, and they are John Boyd's loop or cycle, and they've been applied to business. They've been applied to, I've seen it applied to alternative sexuality insofar as a BDSM scene. Not to get weird, I've seen it applied to every aspect of the military. I've seen it applied to science and research and development. It pretty much goes any place where there's a competitive element. It seems to apply. And how it applies is that you have 4 stages, and I'll break them down into some really simplistic steps to maybe explain it very fast. And forgive my clumsiness, because as I said, I wasn't prepared, but there's an observational stage, and that has to do with your ability to see, perceive, feel, whatever it is, the actions of your opposition or indeed your own place in that. Orientation is usually taken as the second stage, is the second O of the OODA loop. OODA is orientation, and that's where you place yourself in that picture that your observations brought you. The way people usually describe it, it's actually deeper than that if you get into Boyd stuff, but I'll get into that very quickly in a second. Then there's decision, and that's where you make a decision to act. And then there's the actual action. So, for example, if I'm standing there with somebody, I'm going to be looking across at them, and I'm going to see how they're standing in their position. And then I'm going to be able to orient myself in that, which means I'm going to see certain gaps and certain opportunities. And then I'm going to make a decision. I'm going to have a series of choices I can make. I make that choice, and then there's an action. Now, which is maybe my sword hitting the side of their head. Excuse me, I'm left-handed now. Maybe my sword hitting the side of their head. And all of those phases have things that can impede them, things that can speed them up. The way Boyd figured out the observational phase, and this speaks directly to those people that like the full visor helmets, by the way, is he found that the American pilots in Korea were doing far better than the Soviet pilots in fact, the MiG pilots when they were fighting. And he couldn't figure it out because the MiG actually had better performance characteristics. The Russians had as good a training. They had as good a background in air combat. They were very experienced. Many of them were World War II vets as well. And he found that it broke down just simply to the fact that the MiG was using a half canopy, and I think it was a Phantom, but the American jet, the F-4F, I think was. But I'm not a pilot, so forgive me if I'm getting that wrong. But it had a full canopy, which meant that they had a greater opportunity to observe when they were going through their convolutions in a dogfight. And so that obstruction, which you can create that with somebody having a full visor or by placing a shield so they can't see, or any of those things, means that they have less information that they're bringing in. The steps that I break it down, where it's probably, so you're walking down the road and you see down the road that there's a cloud of things flying at you. Now, if you're wearing glasses, if you have your glasses on, maybe you're going to see them sooner, which is going to give you more time. Depending on the sunlight, where the light's in your eyes, or where you're standing, or any of these things, up to and including if you had a good night's sleep, it's going to affect how quickly you're going to see that, track it. But you orient yourself, and part of the orientation process is saying, oh crap, that's a cloud of kill, that's a swarm of killer bees. and and you'll quickly go, and that orientation will include, well, my car is about 50 feet behind me. I can run, you can run so fast to the car, you can jump in the bushes to your right, you can jump in the lake to your left. And then you go through a decision-making process based upon that orientation where you're there, which is, well, I can't hold my breath for very long and those brambles aren't going to stop the bees. So I better turn around, run back to the car, and then get my keys out of my pocket. And depending upon where you place your keys and where you're oriented with it, where your car is positioned, how quickly you can run, your act stage of that OODA loop is going to depend whether you get stung or not. And hopefully that, I mean, I probably I'm not doing it justice, but that's my best shot for right now.
No, I think that's great. And I think, I want to make sure people understand that the decision and action doesn't mean that decision and action could be, you're going to break the other person's OODA loop. And then reset the next one up and try to do it faster. That action could be a defensive action. That action could be a probing action. That action can be, and I'm sure Bess is smiling in her head. That action, so the action doesn't have to be I'm throwing something. That action could be a movement.
Right.
So just be aware. We had a question though on that before I move it on to other people to talk about a little bit. And that is, so in the orientation piece or into the observation piece, would you say what's the difference between the unconscious or conscious mind? In other words, in observation, do I have to think about it, like every little bit of it, or is it unconscious and like, hey, that's a swarm of bees, I'm running, that type of deal?
Well, and this becomes kind of important when we're talking about the OODA loop, because it's so clinical, because it's very mechanical. I mean, I don't want to argue with Mark on pretty much anything. He's brilliant, and he's one of the I find myself very lucky that I can tap him for information upon occasion. But I think he's wrong that he's outside the OODA loop. There's no such thing. But the fact is,
that was kind of a joke.
Well, but the OODA loop can become a largely unconscious process, especially if the orientation is pattern recognition. It doesn't have to be a long, drawn-out process. Now, when you have two corporations that are dueling with each other, that orientation phase can be very long. But when you're talking about a fight, it's frequently unconscious. And the decision that you're going to make is hopefully, because you're talking about speed, it's a pre-programmed decision. Like, he's standing here, I'm standing here, bam, flat snap, it's done. And then you go, oh, I didn't realize I was thinking about that. Well, yes, you were thinking about that because you pre-programmed into your head with slow thought a long time before you flat snapped it. The other thing I think it's important about the OODA loop is it's an unconscious process. You don't know you're going through it. And there's something called decision-making fatigue, which means that you can only go through that loop so many times, which means if you fight somebody like Brannos in particular, this is a trick he does that I'm sharing
all the time.
He screws with your OODA loop enough that you just get exhausted, and then you say, well, and then you can't process any longer. The last big fight I had with my squire, my former squire, Count Oz, I watched him, and he actually said right on the field that I'd broken his OODA loop because I screwed with him. I broke it, and then he just collapsed. And he's a very good fight, and he understands that process. I just happened to have a good day that day, but. I mean, I didn't want to get into too much of that because the OODA loop, like I said, there's been at least 30 books written about it, countless articles. We could talk about it we could all write a PhD dissertation about it. It would only be a drop in the bucket compared to what's been put out there so far.
No, I just wanted to kind of cover it in kind of how we talk about stuff. Bess, just give me a little short one, and then I'll go to Thorfinn, and then Mark after that. But Bess was laughing here for a second, so I'm going to throw it at her.
Well, I was giggling because Brannos was so clearly in agreement with you, Conrad, when you said that nobody's out of the OODA loop. But I do have a question for you. Can the OODA loop, you said it can be very fast. Can it be so fast it seems unconscious or it seems instinctive?
One would, that is the goal always. So yes. Like I said, when you get two attorneys that are fighting in court, their OODA loop is going to start 6 months before trial, where they're going back and forth with motions, where it's taking them 2-3 months to write it. And it's going to end in trial where they're sitting with each other and somebody's making an objection and somebody is, without even thinking about it, addressing the underlying law. And that's a non-fighting example, but a fighting example is, I mean, I guess I can just say yes. It should be, you shouldn't be thinking about it when it's happening at a conscious level. It should all be happening automatically by then.
Thorfinn.
Yeah, so you're saying almost like you could say that muscle memory is part of that through the whole process, that allowing yourself to then be able to strike that blow you talked about that you didn't even know you planned, right? Or you didn't plan it, you just reacted. And so that would be part of that, is shortening your OODA loop by having practice with muscle memory, allowing you to do that.
Well, watch this. If you take a bunch of Olympic level ping pong players and guys of a similar age, guys and gals of similar age, you pull off the street and you say, what I want you to do is press a green or red button, depending upon the light in front of you, they score about the same. But if you put them on a ping pong table, the ping pong players are going to go way fast. It's not a matter of muscle memory, like your hand going quicker. It's if the stimuli is not green or red light, but recognizing a particular technique, they'll hit it faster, even though their muscle memory is not as fast. Frequently, it's not a matter of being faster than somebody else at a purely physical level. It's throwing before you or they even know you're doing it.
Yeah, and in fact, to give you a feel of that, that's why Lomachenko does the numbers, letters on the wall and touches them as fast as he can, because what he's learning to do is he's exercising his mind and seeing decisions fast. So that's an exercise that Lomachenko has been doing, and Eastern European boxers do all the time as well. So this helps that decision-making process be so fast, it becomes a little bit more natural. Mark.
So now I feel called out, so I have to defend myself.
No, go. You don't have to defend yourself. You could just agree.
It's okay for you to be wrong, Your Grace.
My thought process is that all of these things are different ways of talking about the same stuff, and it depends on what mentally you are drawn to. So my joke about being outside of the OODA loop, because I 100% agree, nobody is, right? Everybody's doing that. For me, when I describe my perfect fight, the experience is there's a buildup of tension, and then it breaks, and I just go, and that breath exhales me, takes me through the fight, and then somebody's dead. That's my experience of a perfect fight. But all of those things are happening, right? I just articulate it in an energy and a feel thing. So when I talk to people about, well, how did you flat stamp me? And I say, well, your energy settled and you were planted, or I felt you rising up, so I shortcutted it and popped you in the head before, that's the same kind of stuff. And then sometimes I've actually had somebody say to me, I didn't realize we were going to talk about voodoo bullshit today. I'm like, okay, well, we can talk about instead micro cues if you want, your nostrils flaring, the breath, whatever works for you to tap into that. But it is the best OODA loopage is always at the unconscious level. And so I do something very similar. I hurt my shoulder too. Apparently this is the shoulder hurt group. So I was fighting my former squatter last week, and I wanted to fight very lazy. So I came out and I would present threat, and then threat, and then threat, and then threat, and he would react, and then his reactions would get bigger, and I just tired him out mentally and then just offsided him in the head because I didn't want to have to fight hard. So I made him work mentally super hard for about 45 seconds and then just beat him in the nose because I didn't want to have to work hard physically.
And that's actually a very Eastern European. We see that again with Lomachenko and a lot of Eastern Europeans. The new way pressure is it's about controlling people's tension, not only tension in their body, physical tension, which will hold their breath into them because you're adding tension, your lungs can't expand as much and break their breath down. It physically breaks them down because they're in tension constantly. You can't stay in tension constantly. In other words, I've seen Ron Golder make somebody throw up because he did this. But it also breaks their head down. In other words, it tires their brain because they're constantly have to making decisions. And so you're wearing out your opponent before they even know. In fact, they're like, I don't know why I'm so tired. And you do it like, because I made you tired. That's where you are. But that's part of a fight. And we don't, and this is why we're here. We're trying to help people understand that and broaden our society and broaden our fighting abilities because we all want to be great. and we all want to keep pushing each other. I mean, like Conrad talking to Mark and me and Sean, and I talk to Mark and Conrad and Sean and Rongvalder and Bess is talking and Thorfinn's talking, and we're all talking together because we're trying to learn still, and we want to pass that on to you. And I think that's one of the biggest pieces here. Before we let this go, I'm just gonna, we're a little bit, we're about 10 minutes after, so I'd like to wrap it up. Does anybody have anything they'd really want to say? Everybody good? All right. So I want to say something, and first is thank you. I know there's a ton of folks out that are watching, and future folks are going to be watching on the YouTube side. This was a great conversation, and you guys, I absolutely love listening to both of you. I wish I lived right next to both of you, and we could just do this all the time together. I am lucky to live next to Rongvalder, and I get to do it with him, talk all of this kind of stuff with him. But and Thorfinn said he's going to come see a Wings game with me, and we'll talk then. I think at this point, why don't we go ahead? Side, can you go ahead and bring it up? And you already did into the groups. First, if you have more questions on this, please post them. We'll all be watching, and then we'll try to answer. We have lots of other great fighters on the Coach's Corner who have been giving great answers. I got a document. I will ask all you if you have specific examples, YouTube, audio, website, send them to me. I'll fill in the rest of my document and post it up next week. And it's mostly just going to be a broad-based covering, and then people can dig into those articles because I think they're all important. Definitely, I can't say much more than you guys have really helped the Coach's Corner grow, and I think it's a great resource for people, and I've got a lot of feedback on that. Thorfinn, you know what we got next week?
I do. We have
what do we got?
Next week we have Live from Great Western War, and it's going to be an attempt to try and do a question and answer period with people live asking questions. So it looks like we've got myself, Duke Sean, and I believe the King of Kaid will be joining us. Maybe a couple other people. It just depends on timing for some of the event. Doing it live at an event is going to be a whole thing. And so be patient with us, guys, because I think we may run into some weird technical issues because we're in the middle of nowhere with us filming it and beaming it out through I think probably someone's hotspot on their on laptop or something. Yeah. So we're working through that, but it's going to be kind of an open format. Anyone in the audience, or even if we can get people from the chat to be able to answer questions.
Well, I would suggest you guys do it somewhere, and as people walk by you, just grab them and say, right. Hey, Your Majesty, come over here.
And do it on the move, right? Just get it a wagon and just carry the camera with us.
There we go. I would suggest that you have beers so that you make it entertaining.
Oh, God. Well, I think we're going to host it at this tavern.
Oh, well, hell, that's going to be good already. So, yeah. Well, I'm bumming. I'm going to miss it. I hope you guys have a great time there, and it should be a great episode. I'm definitely going to be watching because I miss wars, I tell you.
Me too.
Well, Side, you want to wrap it up?
Is that Valeric that's going to be on next week? When you say the King of Kaid, or you don't mean the Prince, you mean?
No, yeah, it's going to be the current king. We may grab Valeric if he has time. It really just depends on what everyone's kind of schedule is going to be like. You know how wars are.
You should grab Valeric if you can. Valeric's got a pretty good background in some Russian, Zastrodovy stuff and everything. That he's a cool talk.
Oh, I love that guy. I've known him for years. Yeah, he's really a good guy.
All right, Side.
I want to thank all the coaches again for having this awesome chat with us. And thanks to everybody who asked questions in the comments and everybody who's watching live with us. It's been another great night. So with that, we're going to end it. Good night.
Awesome. Well, come visit us at Coach's Corner, and everybody be safe.